Thank you for tuning in to today's TLDR episode of the Breaking Changes podcast. I'm your host and chief evangelist for Postman, Ken Lane. With Breaking Changes, we explore topics from the world of APIs, but look at it through the lens of business and engineering leadership. Joining me today, we have Ralf Huuck, founder and CEO of Logilica and adjunct professor at UNSW Australia. Ralf shared a pretty sophisticated view of what the API Lifecycle velocity actually means when it comes to not just the technical, but also the business and politics of how software is being delivered within the enterprise. Let's just start with the basics. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kim. Great to be here. I'm Ralf Huuck. I'm the founder and CEO of Logilica. And we are a data analytics company and data intelligence company for engineering leaders. Basically, we are a bit like the second brain for VP of engineering, keeping track of your delivery and production pipelines, grabbing all that data, running data analytics on top of it, and give you sort of the top level radar view about all the activities that's going on. And API is our bread and butter on a daily basis. So it's great to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I was really the view that I'm spending a lot of time in is what's I guess, I don't know, Gartner uses the phrase platform ops, but there's this Venn diagram of a lot of ops. So DevOps, GitOps, platform ops, SecOps, and so I'm living in this spectrum right now. When I first came across what y'all are offering, I'm like, oh yeah, this is I think cut from the same cloth of the world I'm trying to understand. So let's start at the highest levels. What's the value to business and engineering leadership when it comes to what you all are building in that view of the landscape you have?
Yeah. Look, for us, it's really about creating clarity around the engineering process, having a little bit of governance on top of it, but really being able to deliver product faster. So basically from the inception, from the planning state, let's say in your Jira tool, Monday, whatever you're using, shortlist, down to the development pipeline to release and production. How can you make that process as smooth and sort of as quick and as accelerated as possible? And obviously, as you know, there's a lot of bottlenecks in the software development lifecycle, from people being overloaded, from your build server running too slow, from tickets being stuck somewhere. And all of these signals is what we pick up in the software lifecycle through APIs, and then give leadership sort of a top level view around this. How do we able to minimize the friction, keep everyone happy, and being quicker to market? And obviously in that sense, serving our customers better and being able to react to customer input and feedback much quicker than we would be able to normally do. That's really what we are looking after.
Makes sense. Now, for developers on the ground floor, down in the weeds of operations, what's the benefit for us?
So first things, you don't have to do manual reporting anymore. So that's, I think, one of the important things, right? If your boss asks you, hey, what's the status of my tickets? Or hey, how do we do? What did we do last week? Or are we stuck somewhere? What do we need to focus on? The last thing is you want to compile this, talk to 3 of your colleagues, put it in an Excel sheet, and somebody kind of puts it into their Excel sheet. And then at the end of the month, they see, oh, actually the build times is like 3 times as long. Maybe we should address this. So we want to gather that information automatically, cut the overhead and burden for development, but then in turn also give developers a good argument. Look, here we can do it much more of a data-driven approach. Things take too long. Yes, you kind of say we need to get through more tickets, but the build server runs half a day, so we can only do 2 builds a day, and we really can't do the whole test development cycle. Or we have got so many tickets and we only have 3 people. We can't do 5 tickets a day. That's just not realistic. So you get a lot of evidence and a lot of data that you can use to kind of communicate into both directions. And then obviously, the more you move to a more open team culture, the much more you can bring all the sides together and sort of you being able to really see things that you normally don't see. It's not that you don't have that information, but it's typically deep down in some silos. And, if you're a developer, and you probably know this as well, there are certain parts you care about, other parts you really don't care about because it's not your job, but that might as well impact your job. So if that visibility is not there, you kind of have to suffer these consequences about somebody else not seeing that context information. And, bringing that together I think is a real benefit to the developers. Also can say, hey, we are overloaded and this is the reason why. Or, things are going too slow and this is the reason why, instead of sort of blaming, finger pointing, complaining in both directions. So we see that creates much better understanding, better team culture, and happier people is sort of happier delivery. That's at least our point of view.
This is a very observable, transparent, collaborative process. It's not a big brother looking down, monitoring solution for leadership.
No, look, we stay away from this. I know there are solutions out there that kind of measure developer performance. That's not really what we do, what we look into. We don't care whether you produce 20 lines of code or 200 lines of code, because we don't think that's really comparable. It's more about the process. Do we follow process? Do we do code reviews? Is there something where things are stuck? And does it something that needs attention? And that attention could be, let's say, on a daily stand-up. Let's say we have got PRs that have been in review for 3 days. So maybe just somebody forgot about this. So it's information that, nobody needs to know other than the development team. So you can resolve that proactively before it kind of bubbles up later. And it's really not about measuring people's performance, because as probably you and I know, different developers with different tasks, it's not something you want to do or can really do. It's more about the processes. Is the pipeline smooth? Do we deliver smoothly? All these things that kind of, do we work on the right things? If we suddenly have half of the team working on bug fixing, the question is, why is that? So maybe we have too much technical debt that we can address, and so on and so forth. So these are the things we're much more concerned about rather than individual performance. Because, in our view, software development is a team sport. It's about, getting good teams together and getting basically the telematics to optimize your processes around this. And sometimes I use the comparison to Formula One, which is at least quite popular in this part of the world. And, you have these race cars with all the telematics, and it's really about how do you optimize, your race, rather than how do you optimize and blame the driver for not doing the right thing.
So for me, I'm focused on the API lifecycle. So software development lifecycle with the API lifecycle kind of overlaid on it, delivering microservices, public APIs. But velocity means different things to different teams and different APIs. So how does this layer help me understand, truly, what is velocity? What is meaningful or purposeful velocity?
Right. Yeah, and I think that really depends who you're talking to. And that's, as you said, these are the different layers. On an individual developer level, your velocity might be how long does it take you to work through pull request, from open coding, opening a pull request, reviewing it, merging it back into the main branch. And, we can come to DORA metrics in a moment, but, ideally, these cycles are in a 24, 48-hour time frame. And then maybe you have feature tickets. How long does a feature ticket take? Well, typically it should be happening within a sprint, and your sprint might be 2 weeks. So you already see you've got different levels of velocity. And then on top of this, you have your infrastructure. So how many releases or how many builds do you have per day? How many releases do you have per day? And how successful are the releases? And that's where we can come to the DevOps more of metrics like DORA metrics. And all these different velocities speak to different levels of the people in the organization, but it all needs to fit together in order to deliver smoothly. Because if it's any of those velocities is really stuck, then you probably have a problem.
So is this an additional layer? Is this part of if I'm an API product manager, is this part of my feedback loop that I should be building into everything that I take into account as I'm iterating and moving forward my products?
Maybe tell me a bit more about what your API product manager is doing in his regular day job.
I'm focused on business outcomes and business objectives, and I'm hopefully aligned with my consumers, and I have I have a feedback loop in place with them, but that's very dependent on the velocity of my team, the quality, the reliability of the builds, because the APIs could be building, but I could be issuing a lot of patches, or there could be other quality issues in there. So I'm, as a product manager, I'm worried about my consumer, them getting what they want and when they need, and being agile and flexible that way.
Yes. So in a way, this is your internal feedback loop, right? So from our point of view, it's everything from inception to shipping it out of the door. And then obviously it's over to the customer side. And then you have got the typical log monitoring and type of external feedback and consumer feedback, sentiments, and so on. But how do you create that internal, the internal steps that are typically quite often, engineering is sort of an art form and it's a black box and you don't really see what's going on. If you can bring clarity to that one, so you can streamline your processes much better, organize teams, see where you need to allocate this, and basically your internal spend you can allocate to the right problems and make sure that you have the delivery as efficiently as possible.
So how at this layer would you say how much of the friction that you most commonly see is people or technology issues?
I think that goes hand in hand. So if you have technology issues, you're going to have people issues. So if, it goes, it starts off with your common tooling. If people don't enjoy their tooling, they're going to be frustrated, and you have people issues. Obviously, it's a bit of a team culture and an organizational culture thing as well. And, we can't discount that. If you have very much a command and control organization where people don't work together and just get dictated what they have to do, better data doesn't necessarily help you more, because it's probably somebody in the organization has got some vested interest that data doesn't get shared around, it is not visible, because it takes away some of the command and control power. But I think especially in more modern organization, and especially, working in a hybrid world, working remotely, if you don't get that information together, people will feel very isolated. They don't have a view what's going on. And it really becomes difficult both from an engineering, but also from a management side. We've been working mostly remotely in the last 2.5 years. And it's difficult to always stay on top of all the different activities going on. When you're not in the same room, normally you don't need to have even a stand-up or a meeting. You see what's going on, what's happening at the desk behind you. You always sort of get that sense around the right signals. Is somebody frustrated? Do things not work? Or is there sort of a sense of panic? If you just do this remotely via Slack or other tools, it's very difficult to get these signals and that sense. So, I think it's a matter of, combining. In the end, you don't do technology for technology's sake, but, to get some outcome. That might be faster product delivery, happier customer, or happier teams. Ideally, all of the above. But how do you get those signals, and how are you able to stay on top of all the other activities that you normally have to do? I think so. It's these two parts come together.
What do you see contributes to happy teams? Like, what are the things that alleviate that pressure from that teams face regularly?
Yeah. Look, I think one is sort of trust from leadership. If a leader trusts their team, the team feels empowered to do the right decisions. And what I think no team or no developer ever likes micromanagement. I think that's probably the last thing that's on somebody's mind. At the same time, from a product manager, team lead, VP of engineering, you want to know, are we on track? Do we do the right thing? How are things progressing? And again, if you're not sitting in the same room, you don't want to Slack somebody twice a day. Hey, how are we going? How are we going? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? So if you get sort of these signals fed a little bit and say, okay, everything's on track. I can see my epics are progressing. I can see our deployments are running quite smoothly. I don't have to even interact in the terms of, asking people of how are we going, because I have the confidence. So, and you can kind of build that trust over time. And I think secondly, I mean, it's always, as you know, when it comes to major releases, there's always a bit of a crunch time. So everyone's kind of busy. You find a lot of things in QA that you think you would have never need to worry about. There's certain features that might or might not ship, and not everything comes together at the very end. And I think that's sort of normal. You just want to make sure it doesn't become the normal, that it happens continuously. So maybe you can see a spike on activity, things take a bit longer, certain things, people have too many PRs open. Let's say you have 4 PRs open in parallel. That's kind of quite stressful. That might be okay coming up leading to the release, but afterwards you want to get into more calmer waters again. So as a developer, I'm probably happy to keep up for this for a week or maybe 10 days before the release, but I don't want to have this all the time. Again, so it becomes a balancing act about, being able to accept certain situations, but making sure they don't go out of control. And if you as an organization have sort of the trend that points to the wrong directions, let's say reviews don't get done, things take too long, people maybe leave, that's a sort of a different indicators. I think that's sort of something we need to quite cautious about and see what do we do that needs to be addressed more principally to kind of help the teams and help the organization as well.
Yeah, so there's the part, I mean, coming from my view of the landscape, again, API, deploying APIs, what you all offer can give me a lot of visibility and just a lot more awareness as part of our release process across teams organizationally. But the other part that you touched on when we first opened is, and I find a lot of companies don't see this layer, is our infrastructure has APIs, and that's what really powers and fuels what you all are building. And so there's a pretty huge opportunity to capture that data exhaust. I mean, you guys are demonstrating that on a daily basis, and then bring use that for intelligence and making sense of the landscape.
Yeah. Look, I think one aspect, don't want to reach too much far into the future, is basically also the cost aspect. You have a lot of infrastructure. Can you marry up that infrastructure with cost? Let's say your cloud cost. Do you know how much your EKS cluster is actually costing this? How does it scale? Again, you have got the APIs, but it's probably different APIs in different systems that kind of need to be married up. Here a little bit, let's talk FinOps, for example, because it's one of the ops you didn't mention in your introduction. It's another aspect, right? How do you now correlate all this with your internal cost? And, how much does a product feature cost you? And how do you kind of feedback that back into the whole lifecycle process? And again, when you have got all the APIs, you have got the infrastructure APIs, but marrying up that data, that's obviously not straightforward.
So
but
data-driven ops, but ops spread across all these different areas allows me to be more aware, but then optimize my spend. Sounds like a pretty good opportunity for automation there as well, too.
I think so as well. And it goes back to, if you're in sales or marketing, people use Power BI and have their BI tools. In engineering, you don't plan that way yet. But I think, it's the reason. One of the reasons is because, old school waterfall, you never had enough data to make those decisions. Your development cycles were quite long. They took months. And at the end, somebody does some testing. I mean, obviously, even in the old days, it wasn't exactly like this, but you didn't just get this short cycles to get enough data. And it's really like, infrastructure moving to agile. In a way, you have got all these data points. So now you can kind of help to smooth out the trajectory and move along towards, the goals you just mentioned. And I think that's really one of the changes why, this more data-driven approach makes sense today, and probably it didn't really make sense 10 years ago, because your development processes, infrastructure Also, engineers haven't been really empowered running infrastructure, managing DevOps processes. So I think it's already much more distributed than it used to be. Now, with all these distributed information, how do you bring the overall, let's say, engineering radar back in so that you're moving into the right direction?
This seems pretty key. I would say one of the number one asks, the top two asks I get from enterprise customers when it comes to API landscape, kind of the highest levels, discovery, where's all of our APIs and where's all of our infrastructure and what's going on? They just don't have any visibility. And then governance, they want to be able to, because they can't ever realize any governance because they can't actually see most of it and understand it. So this sounds like a really, I was just reading one enterprise group, I won't mention their name, but they're saying, we have 68 teams who've all been doing their own thing for a number of years. And we got them to agree to a single gateway strategy and policy strategy, but they all have their own software development lifecycle. But we've got to figure out a way to start mapping that, understanding it, having our finger on the pulse of it, and then driving it in a specific direction.
Yeah, I think, governance is a very good point here. And, understanding, especially in the enterprise environment, what are you actually doing? And there's reasons why people have different software development life cycles, right? They might have front end, back end, different product lines and so on, infrastructure. So they probably shouldn't be exactly the same. But if you don't have any visibility into this, it's a lot of chaos, right? And chaos always means it's really unpredictable, and you don't know where to action this. And the governance aspect that you said, okay, let's first gather the information about what we are actually doing. Once you have got that information, you can start some discussion and some decision-making process. You probably don't want to jump to conclusions in the first second, but you can sort of see, okay, this is where we are at. And that's probably in the API lifecycle very similar. I can imagine you have got, people struggle with do they have APIs? What versions of APIs do they use? What about vulnerabilities in APIs? What's the remediation path? All these different things. And again, it probably speaks to different groups with different priorities. And, there's always fires that are burning, but which ones do you address more principally?
Yes, and perpetually responding to whatever those application needs are, not the holistic overall organizational or strategy and without much awareness of how other teams build things. So I can see the data being able to equip teams with this just to get them being able to understand what's happening, have visibility into other teams and get kind of notifications on what is happening, what is the software development lifecycle for those groups over there, and how can I learn from it, or how can they learn from me?
Yeah, very true. How does governance, how does Postman deal with governance? Because it's a big topic, right? So where do you even start, and what sort of the priorities that you see from a Postman's point of view? This is sort of my top three things I would really, or our customers would really like to have addressed.
Governance like most things in the API world, means many different things to many different people, depending on who you talk to. Same with the API lifecycle. Well, what's the API lifecycle? You'll get a different opinion from different folks. So governance tends to start with consistency of the interface. So the design and the patterns we use. And starting with REST, like using HTTP 1.1 and then having common, whether it's the design and everything. So that's the widest swath of what people think is governance. And so at design time, you try to apply certain governance. So when you're designing your API and developing it, but then the other side is, a set of rules that will lint and check for that in the pipeline. So there's like rules engines called like Spectral that allow you to say every API has to have this header. and here's the rule. And then that gets put into the pipeline. So Postman is known as a testing tool, and you can write contract tests and you can run those against your APIs, and then you can put those into your pipeline. Governance is just kind of getting layered on that. So you'll do your contract tests, your performance tests, your security tests, and then your governance tests, all as kind of a suite at the pipeline layer. But depending on how well your team's been educated about those rules, why they matter, about good API design, you're going to have all kinds of pissed off developers who hit the pipeline, and it fails. So I think, and they don't have any sort of visibility into why. So I can see more awareness at this layer that you're all speaking to. I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the why is quite important, and why, and also then goes back to team culture. I think that's important as well. So we're definitely not the solution for everyone. If you decide clarity and visibility and sharing is not something your organization wants, then we're probably not the right partner for you, to be frank here. But I think, developers are, hard to find. Keeping developers is even harder. And I think that needs to be appreciated. And, the same way that products are built more and more bottom up, I mean, the culture needs to be built in a similar way. And I think even more traditional enterprises, we see that changing quite a bit. Because nobody just wants to be the coding monkey that's told what to do without having input and understanding. I think people feel much more empowered when they understand why they do things, and why, from feature to delivery to processes is really the whole why thing. Why do I do this? And if you see how you fit into this why and the whole end-to-end story, I think it makes a much better experience from, being part of an engineering organization. And, previously I've been working in different organizations, from R&D to large enterprises to startup. And obviously in a startup organization, you see everything end to end. So that's great. And anything you touch, you see the impact of it. But obviously the moment you scale and you move to a large organization, that's difficult. But at least if okay, this is the big picture, ideally beyond your annual company meetups or whatever you're running, like your QBRs or something like this, the more you understand, okay, this actually makes sense, and I see where we are moving and why we are moving that way. And that might be just, changes of the infrastructure, changes why APIs might be much more important, and, why we might become much more, let's say, modular, distributed, running on different infrastructure. I think that all kind of helps to get a better feeling and understanding, because as a developer, of course, you understand what the latest trends are. And if you see you're part of that, that's always a good thing, rather than, oh yes, my organization hasn't innovated for 20 years and we still do it that way while the rest of the world moved on. So I think that's the most frustrating thing, unless you really don't care too much about your job.
Yeah, I think for me, one thing I've learned in tech in the last 20 years is the scale of things. It's very virtual. It's hard to see, whatever C means. Hard to see releases, hard to see your APIs. Like, people always ask me, what's an API? And they're difficult to see. And so anything that helps us see that, but understand our position in it, and then understand what's possible. So do you feel like the type of awareness that this data-driven approach brings, can we set up different kind of tiers of guardrails for developers based upon juniors? Because we have a lot of turnover of staff and developers come and go. Can we set up appropriate sets of guardrails for junior, mid, senior level developers so that they can experiment safely in an aware environment?
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure guardrails, at least the different views and visibility. I think if you're junior, right, I mean, know this from junior and people in my team, they are not so much interested into the end-to-end delivery. They're interested in their task, whether their pull request kind of gets reviewed, whether it's stuck somewhere, whether they need help and reach out. So you basically get things around, review coverage, latency, lead time to change, these types of things on a more, let's say, smaller scale level. Well, obviously, if you're a team lead or a bit more senior, you'd like to see a bit more end-to-end those things. You don't maybe care about the small things because these things are running anyway. So it's a bit of a different view. Again, I think we're not so much in favor of control, but more about visibility and different views and different insights, speaking to different stakeholders. If you're VP engineering, really, you don't care about how quick Joe's or Kin's PR is going to be resolved. You're saying, okay, how many people do I have on which features, and how quickly can we deliver those features? Everything else, and how much does it cost me? And everything else is sort of a bit goes down in the noise, and you don't need to see this as long as you have sort of a trail of evidence why that is actually the case. So, you don't get just a number of pretty charts, but you have the ability to drill down into this and then see, okay, down up to, the lower level that you need. Let's say your build performance or the actual tickets people are working on, because it might be, yes, it takes a long time because it's complex. So at least you have got that trail of evidence to have the communication across sort of your teams or, with your team members, rather than saying, I drive the KPIs or guardrails by some number, and unless we have 15, we're not doing good. And when we do 16, we are great. So that's, if you don't have that context, that's always difficult.
Context is key. So shifting, I know you depend on APIs for this data-driven approach across many providers. What are your biggest frustrations when it comes to having to run your business, support your customers, using other people's APIs? Maybe outages. I don't know if there's been any outages from major providers lately we won't mention, but yeah.
No, look, outages is probably not the main issue. It's probably all the undocumented bits in the APIs, where, the documentation and the APIs are not in sync. Some surprising bugs, where the REST API works okay, but the GraphQL API doesn't do the same thing for not obvious reasons. Or, the driver, using Python works, using JavaScript doesn't work. I think those things are frustrating. And in general, just for building a product. I think for maintaining a product is always version changes, behavioral changes. How do you track that? Can you get notified in time that things gonna break? I think that's some of the challenges. And then I think everything in sort of the container Kubernetes space, that's always quite interesting because you've got a lot of things auto-scaling, and if they don't do, why is that happening just now and not yesterday? So anything related to timing, concurrency issues or something like this that might come up, I think that's difficult. But I think top one is probably bugs and documentation, and top two, I would say, is versioning. That's always...
For me, name of the show is Breaking Changes, so thank you for talking about breaking changes. Always helps my cause. I don't really believe there's breaking changes. I mean, everything's a breaking change, but they're just not communicated. Things aren't communicated and planned. It's not that it's a breaking change. It's just you got to let people know what's going on.
And even if you let people know it's going on, having a release note somewhere hidden on your website is not something that somebody ever will learn about unless it's too late, and maybe it reaches some Stack Overflow channel with a link back to that release note. So we recently had interesting experiences where people changed sort of their access control in unforeseen circumstances, let's put it like this, and suddenly we don't get data in anymore. And really, until you went to the sort of vendor's bug channel, you wouldn't really see that this is some major, well, not a major change. It's a corner case we hit. Let's put it like this. But it's sort of something that wasn't coming to our attention early enough.
Yeah, it's that sort of visibility, communication, observability. That one of the areas I'm really focused on right now is the relationship between the API producer and the consumer, and making that as interactive and real time as possible. And Postman has what's called public workspaces. So think of a public workspace, or we have private and partner ones too. But you can have a portal, like an API portal, but it's for an intended audience, and it's more than just your docs. It's got your API monitors, your contract tests, the results. So you're exposing more of your operations with your consumer, so that they know, they understand, they see the tests that you're running. They have access to your mocks. Do you feel like at the data-driven layer that at source control and CI/CD, do you think there's ever a potential for a view of that data that would be with your consumers or publicly, like to show your velocity or reveal more data from behind your operations?
Yeah, look, I think our primary consumer are sort of company internal, right? So we provide that information for your own organization. And I mean, we are, for our own data collection, we are a big fan of sort of static typing, static analysis. So it's basically the bit what you talk about contracts, to make sure that all the different bits and pieces work together quite well. Look, for that internal development process, I don't think we intend to share that necessarily with the customer. I can see that maybe in terms of, if you're a service provider, you basically you provide bodies for some other company. You want to show, yes, I'm doing best practices, something around that case. It's probably a bit a different use case than sort of showing your development process to the end user directly. I think as an end user, what I care about is that I get the right products that provide me business value, and I get them quick enough. How exactly they do that magic there, it's probably secondary. Yeah. While me as an internal company, I want to deliver, I want to create that magic, and I want to be consistent around that magic. So that's what I care about, to the other side of the consumer-producer contract. I want to deliver you the best product possible in the shortest amount of time, and ideally have a little bit of a profit margin there. And as a consumer, I want to exactly achieve or receive that type of product.
Yeah, interesting. That again, back to that API product manager, like that feedback loop, and I'm always just fascinated by how it evolves. What is it in different industries? And so I'm lucky enough to have the show where I get to talk to people about and learn the different ways. So back to what you're seeing in your offerings, what you see with customers. Are they largely needing to do this on-prem, in the cloud, a hybrid? Are they looking for VPC options? Like what's the kind of makeup of the landscape?
Look, it's really a bit different. We are very much focused around cloud and people who already use SaaS or cloud products. You might have, I said, your GitHub, GitLab, Bitbuckets, you use your Jira, you have your Circle CI, GitHub Actions, you have some deployment tools. You already have a lot of things in the cloud, and you probably made a conscious decision not to host your own infrastructure and not to, build up your own data centers. So those are the ones that are kind of our ideal customers, because they use modern systems. They already have APIs. We connect easily with that APIs. They become sort of first-class connectors in our system. The customer can authenticate with their own OAuth, SSO, token-based. So we don't need to know any about this. We don't need to touch this. So that's all good. And it stays encrypted wherever it can, and REST as well as in transit, because it's all your metadata, and we don't need to know this. Obviously, if you come to let's say the top end of town, there's still quite a bit that's run on-prem. They might have their own private clouds, and that for those, we probably come to a more customized solution because, as you know, in those situations, nothing is out of the box anymore because things have been growing over time. And as you just said earlier in the discussion, you might have so many different teams that have different software life cycles. Typically, they come in through acquisitions, mergers, the usual activity. They have different environments. So how do you harmonize this? And so we typically work through some priority plan, how we onboard them, what's the most important teams, what do you want to onboard? And then, yes, there might be still some, I don't want to name any tools, but some old on-prem tools that probably no longer support it. And you might or might not want to have that data there as well, or just focus on sort of the next generation of your company evolution.
Yeah, it's interesting the incentives for people to modernize and move into the cloud. And it's one of the common kind of talking points that I have with guests is kind of their maturity, where they're at in their journey, depending whether in the financial or healthcare. And it's always fascinating to see where people are. So in your journey, what's the roadmap look like? What's next for your roadmap? What are you guys investing in?
Yeah, look, I think the correlation with cost becomes much more pressing. And then this way, I'm just talking cloud cost here, not so much around people. But can you sort of, two things, right? Can you measure how much does a feature cost me? How much does a product cost me? How does it scale with my user base? Is that assumption, and especially, moving from data center on-prem to cloud, how much do we depend on this? And if you have ever seen some AWS Google bill, it doesn't really give you a lot of insights around, based back to product features. It tells you use so much storage, you use so much compute, but how does it scale? So I think that's one of the areas that's really quite important. And the other thing is probably more on the deployment side. I mentioned already, let's say the quality aspect. How does your deployments, how successful are you? How long does it take you to recover if something is not successful? And maybe a third aspect is also, and you touched on this earlier, what's about your customer sentiment? Can you feedback that in as well? Let's say you have some customers say, I never used that feature. Why do you have it there? Is there a way to feedback that in? At the moment, these are really two disparate tools and two separate worlds. And it's not something I would say that's on our near-term roadmap, but it's sort of that keeps us thinking what's going to be the future like, and how do we move from the internal data driven. That's one thing you have now. Then you have all the observability, log monitoring, and so on, which is a little bit your infrastructure external data driven, and you maybe have sentiments on top of that as well. How do you marry up the whole thing? And it's not something that we're going to solve tomorrow. But maybe the day after, we should really think about how that all fits together. Because again, it goes from me to you, back to me. How do we work, and how do we sort of create the right things?
This having my API product manager hat on earlier, this is a common vein I'm getting across conversations here on Breaking Changes, but also with Postman customers is strengthening that feedback loop when it comes to product management. So you talked about the cost. Like, tell me the cost of the feature. What does this cost? Like, flip to the biz ops, throw another ops in there, is what are we charging? What's the revenue? What are we making off of this? How many customers are using it? Now you've got a really sweet feedback loop when it comes to me as a product manager getting what I need. Which features are stay? Which ones go? How much did they cost us? And back to the predictability of all of this. That's pretty sweet. A pretty sweet spot.
I think there's still room for more powerful APIs as well, right? How do you make that all API driven rather than sort of having some salespeople or some other systems in the loop and your Excel sheets that, probably kept in certain parts of the organization to manage all this. But how does it become a, machinery crossing different organizational silos?
Yeah.
Then there's probably room for quite some nice APIs.
Yeah. Well, wow. This is I think we did pretty well for this podcast. That covered a lot of ground, but very valuable. I appreciate you sitting down with me today and spending time to talk about your view of the landscape.
Thanks a lot for having me, Ken. And yeah, I think it was great to explore a little bit outside my usual scope to see how that all, how you feedback that from the enterprise clients as well, and how that, the API world and the data world just really two things of the same coin.
This is what I love doing, pulling people out of their silos. I mean, I feel like that's what APIs are about, is exposing us to the outside world. But then I get to learn about your world too and your views. So.
Indeed.
All right, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Ralf for stopping by. You can find more about Logilica at logilica.com, and you can find Ralf on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to the Breaking Changes podcast at postman.com/events/breaking-changes. I'm your host, Ken Lane, and until next time, cheers.